On this project, I decided to stretch my beginner hobbyist woodworking skills a bit and attempt to recreate a high-end piece of furniture from a professional Japanese furniture maker. The end result was a 3-month-long project completion with a 2-month complete hiatus, including frustration in the middle. Follow along and let me know if I fared well in my attempt to grow my woodworking skills. A little more context. Back in January this year, I decided to leave my corporate world of 15 years to dive deep into woodworking full-time, and without a proven path to becoming a professional, as in actually make a living from this. As to that reason why, I'll hold on to that personal sentiment till the end of the video. But for this video, and the bulk of it, and the reason why I'm doing YouTube is to grow my skills in an accountable way and connect with others who want to gain insight on how to learn a particular hard skill, which in this case I did learn 6 new skills. But I also want to learn skills that aren't easy to visually see, which in my case was to handle adversity, solving problems, and learn and adapt from self-reflection. One of the best forms of learning a new skill is actually just to mimic others. We learned this when we were little, and me being a younger sibling, I was able to learn just by watching and mimicking my older brother. And I learned all the things I needed to do to not get into trouble. Thanks, Lee. Now, to grow my skills, I knew I needed to try a project that seems out of reach but doable. One of my favorite woodworking channels is Ishitani Furniture. I feel everything he builds is a masterpiece. Also, his skills are something I want to aspire and obtain. In searching on his channel, I came across a trestle table from 6 years ago that I thought I could attempt. Now, if you haven't been blessed by watching this master at work, I'll give you a little background, as if you want to mimic what he does, it's actually not that easy because his videos are more in the day of a life versus a detailed breakdown of the skills. The skill part, the learning aspect of that, you have to go seek that out yourself. So in this video, and any future videos, when I learn a new hard skill, 99% of the time it's going to come from some other source, and I want to be sure to credit and link to that channel and the creator who gave me that deeper guidance. Now, this leads me to my first insight into this project, which is taking on a growth project that's within your reach. When I picked this project to mimic, I thought to myself, this table looks simple and streamlined. First mental mistake, I oversimplified the solution at hand. I failed to note in the video each step of the ones I visually saw and the ones I didn't see, that if A, could I do it, and B, do I have the tools to do it. In hindsight, since I didn't document what was needed, I found that I needed to learn 6 new skills and buy or build 3 tools or jigs. This was the primary reason why the project took so long, had all the heartburn, quit for 2 months, came back. That's all because I didn't account for it. Flattening a tabletop with hand tools isn't necessarily a new skill for me, but it is a skill I want to get better at, so I thought I would capture how I've gone about it in this video. First off, you saw me sliding down with a straight edge. In this case, it was my level to see where there were high spots that I needed to knock down. I didn't put it in video, but I did knock those down quickly to get a more uniform level for my jack plane to take full passes from edge to edge. And with my jack plane, I take several passes, which a pass is taking cuts in both directions of the material in 45-degree angles, which is a less aggressive cut for blowout. So equal material is being taken out when I take those passes. Once I get full shavings edge to edge, I then take my level out again, look to see if there are any gaps or light coming through, and once it's flat, then I know I'm ready for my smoothing plane. And with that, which is my number 4.5 plane, I take full passes from the length of the table to the end. This helps clean up what the jack plane did from leveling, thus making it silky smooth. I will say I truly love this part of the process and feeling the wood. Weird obsession, whatever. Call me out. Leave me a comment in the comments. Let's take a look at the first part of the project that put my skills to the test, which is the sliding tapered dovetail. Now, the purpose of these is to create a batten that connects the legs to the tabletop with a type of joinery that is strong enough that holds it together yet allows for seasonal wood movement. Oh, and it also doesn't involve any screws. The concept is similar to how a wedge works. The male and female portions of the joint are tapered on one side and flat on the other. The friction alone keeps the joint intact. The added complexity of this is the dovetail portion. The taper keeps the material from moving side to side, and the dovetail keeps it moving from up and out of the connecting piece. The skill took a lot of YouTube searching, as I saw a few people make videos on the skill, but only found one that went into detail on attempting it with an actual piece of furniture. So shout out to Brian Lee for attempting the table, or the same table, and expanding upon the challenging part of the project. Link in the description. The process follows that you mark out very thoroughly at your tabletop bottom as it relates to the thickness of your batten. You don't want to round up more material in the tabletop than the batten, or the dovetail has nothing to hold on to. You actually want to go a bit shorter so there's enough of the shoulder on the dovetail so it can rest on the tabletop when wedged in. The marking of your tabletop is the most important step here, as it gives you a clear reference on how much taper you are adding and over how far of a distance. Now you will need this when you transfer it over to the router table. I'll get to more of that in a minute. Now back to my actual tabletop, I'm actually taking 3 passes to remove material. The first pass is a straight 90-degree route with a straight bit to remove bulk of the material so the dovetail has a bit of an easier job to tackle. Also, you can route slightly above your depth line with the straight bit as you will completely flatten with the dovetail bit on the second and third pass. Now that you remove the bulk of the middle of the material in your dovetail joint, your second pass, you will do another straight 90-degree route on one of the sides. In my case, I chose the right side with a dovetail bit. Be sure to account for the shoulder. All of this can be validated with the markings that you have on your tabletop as it relates to your jig. One thing to note with the dovetail bit, when you stop the router, do not pull up immediately or as it'll eat through your material. So turn it off, back out the router, and then now we can go and do the last pass. On this pass, the last one, you're going to cut the opposite side, but there's going to be a caveat to it. You will start the jig, align it just like at 90 degree, like you did all your other cuts, but what you're going to do is move the part that's closest to you away from the line so you create a slight taper along the edge. Now, how far you move that out, depends on how strong of a taper you want to do, but since this is a very thin piece of material, 3/4 inch, 1 inch thick, we're going to move this 1/16 of an inch. That's part closest to you, and then the part that's farthest away from you stays at the 90-degree mark where the original straight line is. And this will create a slight taper or angle all the way along the edge, so as you move your piece of material in, it can more or less create a giant wedge that adds a dovetail to it that secures your batten. Last part of this before we go over to the router table is to clean up the edges so my batten can sit flush to this edge. Doing a little bit of chisel work here just to make sure it's dead flat and has the proper angles. Now that we have that cleaned up, it's time to go over to the routing table, and this is where we can use some deck of cards to recreate the 1/16 inch taper and apply that to one of these edges of the batten, and this will help change the routing trajectory when we run it through the router table. One thing to note here is that you need to have your blade or your routing bit the same height or depth that you took in your batten, so that way this batten sits flush when you slide it in. Now my first pass here, I am actually doing the taper cut here, and you can see the deck of cards push my piece of material out so it gets away from the router blade. And when we take a close look here, we can see that the dovetail slightly improves as we go through the material, and that's how we create the tapered dovetail. So you'll take one pass with that tapered deck of cards method, and after that you're going to flip to the other side of the batten, the opposite side, and take a straight 90-degree route on this pass. And what you're going to do is take several small passes, very small, and keep going back to your tabletop to see how far the batten can slide in without tension. You want to creep up on it just enough until there's about 1 to 2 inches from the edge. This is where you can actually drive it home with a mallet. And key thing to note here is thinking about the concept of a wedge. You want the tension to be seamless on both sides. This requires small increments in the material you remove. If for some reason you overcut, you can insert a small, very small wedge on the taper side to more or less reclaim the space you took off. Not that sexy, but it works. Now the step I'm doing right here is actually cutting off the edges of the end of the batten, so that way this can rest as a shoulder on top of the bottom of the tabletop. Now, I will say this step was the major thing that I had to overcome, and one of the reasons why I gave up on the project for 2 months, because I could not figure out a tapered sliding dovetail. But now that I've cleared that hurdle, let's take on another one, which is the tapered bridal joint. Now, I had to look this one up, so leave a comment below if I got it wrong or mislabeled it, but this is where you create a U-shaped cut in the wood and a respective tenon that sits in it. The tapering part was a design choice that I had in the leg, and I wanted the batten to receive that tapered angle. This is a new skill, seemed rather straightforward as it mirrors a mortise and tenon, but added a taper to the angle for a unique look. That way my legs have a not straight up and down kind of feel. What you see here is me routing out the tenon part of the bridal joint on the table leg base. And this is going to be a straight 90-degree angle, so it's kind of the simple part of my design where the top, the batten part, will have the taper. But I start here first so I can get a nice snug fit before I start doing my routing out of the mortise, I think that's right, of the leg part. Now we're back at the table saw. I have moved the blade up to the exact same height that will fit the tenon in. And I start in the middle of the board and then flip it around each cut so that way I know it's dead center. And then very so slightly creep in on that cut so that way you can get it to have a snug fit for the bridal joint. Now, here's where I get to the tapering part that adds the new complexities and skills that I have not done before. So I'm marking in the distance up from the bottom, and then at the top I'm marking in, I believe it's about like an inch, it looks like half an inch. And I have a slight taper all the way down to where it goes to a 90-degree at the bottom of the table leg where the base sits. Now we're back at the table saw using my tapering jig. Shout out to Micro Jig for the plans there, super simple. And I am making the pass seamless on this so that I have exact accuracy and safety on this cut. And you can see it drop off right there, so it's right at the 90-degree, it doesn't cut anymore. So the last part here is the cut on the batten, which I did the exact same way with a 90-degree cut. But the tapered part, I transfer what I did at the leg onto the batten so I can ensure that I get a nice snug fit. I just felt more comfortable using hand tools versus power tools. And you can see here, nice fit. And once you get that dialed in, you go back over to the table saw, do the exact same process of removing material. Then we clean it up with some nice chisel work. So this next part I've actually done once, which is a through tenon. Now, I will say it was a terrible job, so I'm going to call this as a no skill that I need to learn. And the key thing about a through mortise, at least what I've consumed, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you need to have clear markings on both sides. And part of that is that you need to sever the fibers on the opposite side, so when you actually chisel through, you don't blow out your material and it looks terrible on the outside. Now here's me flipping it over and severing the fibers just slightly on the opposite side, so when I cut through you don't see blowout on the sides. And now that I've got that set in, I'm gonna have to measure the actual stretcher, and the best way to do that is put your piece of furniture together in a dry fit and mark as a reference to what is actually in the setup itself, so that way you don't have to mess up in your measurements. Now here I'm actually marking out the tenon and the shoulder that sets into the stretcher. I don't know the exact distance here, but it looks fairly enough to register in the leg. Now the process I'm going here is that I want equal cuts on both sides, so I just flip the board and I'm using the table saw, moving it up as close as possible to the line, and then coming back to my bench here and just using a table saw to cut the edge flush to the shoulder. And to keep on the pattern of hand tools and cleanup, we'll take chisel work and get it all nice and flush. One thing I'm not sure on, but I just want to kind of poll the group here. My stretchers, I believe you should have sit somewhat loose in your legs, and then whatever locking mechanism, you want that to be able to tighten it up. That way, like when a user puts it together, it's not over cumbersome, but when they cinch it up with a tightening tool, it's good. Now this next part is a new skill. It's adding on top of our previous one, which is a through tenon, but I'm building out a tusk, more or less like a fancy wedge that allows this to, or the stretcher to cinch up here. Did you catch that error? I blew it out. So here is what happens when you don't back up your piece. I fixed it by gluing it back together, but still annoying. What I'm doing here is I'm actually marking over the 5-degree taper, so you can see that it sits flush to the through tenon. But what I'm going to do is take a tapering, just kind of reference block that I cut at the table saw at 5 degrees, so that I can make the mortise at a slight angle. So when I put the wedge in, very similar to our sliding dovetails, it wedges in there with full friction end to end. And that feels quite good. Now that we wrapped up our final dry fit, and I like to do a few passes to clean up the material before we do a glue up. And on the battens here, I'm doing a slight chamfer on all the edges. And actually I'm doing that on all the pieces of material because that's part of the design and look. And I find when you go through and clean up your material with a hand plane, it actually is smooth, so you don't really need to sand it. That may be wrong, but whatever. Here I am now doing the final glue up on the battens and driving that home. I'm only putting glue at the end of this piece, so it locks in at one edge, but allows for the rest of the batten to move for seasonal wood movement. For the leg base, since these are going to be fixed and I want to have these very secure and they're not rocking back and forth, I'm putting dowels in to ensure that we get an opposite grain inside the piece of material so that it is rock solid. This is the last part of the build, and I left the top of the legs unattached permanently to the battens so that I can knock down the furniture and someone can move this about fairly easy. And the way you get about doing that is using what we call a tapered reamer. And this is more or less a drill bit that has a slight angle from one end to the other. So that way when you create a corresponding piece of material to fit in there, it has a friction fit, much like all the rest of our other tapering joinery. And it's incredibly strong and rigid when you put it to the test. And here I'm actually putting those in, testing it out and seeing that it doesn't budge. You can see the table moves up and down, and fairly easy. You just take a hammer, knock them in and knock them out. It's a pretty straightforward process, way better than screws. Finish them up, I get them in place and I cut them to the exact length that I want them to be visible when I install them. Let's put a little bit more detail around the tapered reamer and the tapered tenon cutter. And the purpose of this is to create pegs that have a snug friction fit that has a mirrored angle on both ends of the entry and exit point. To achieve that result, that's where we take that drill bit that you see right here that's angled, and you will create a custom tenon cutter like I have here, more or less a giant pencil sharpener. And you'll take your dowel here and turn it. I'm turning the opposite way, but you would turn it into the blade just like a pencil, and it will sharpen at the exact angle of your tapered reamer, thus creating a snug fit when you hammer it in. That wraps up the build. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the channel if you want to follow along in my journey. Also, to further explain on the career-changing topic from me leaving the corporate world to woodworking full-time, was that I missed making real products that I could touch versus digital products that hardly ever got to see others enjoy. It would take months. With woodworking, I can see that immediately and really enjoy it. Thanks again, and I hope you enjoy the video.